Hey everyone, it's JJ Lip, a dual major in animal science and ag business here at Casper College. Today I'm going to be talking about Norway's economy for my final project in the agricultural macroeconomics class for the fall 25 semester. So let's get started. So today we're going to be going over an introduction, which is going to be the location and history, along with the government system found in Norway, the gross domestic product or GDP, some currency rates, labor market, inflation rates, standards of living, along with some exports, imports, country relationships, and also an outlook and future economy projection for Norway. So let's talk about Norway's location. Norway is located in northern Europe on the Scandinavian peninsula and is actually one of the furthest north countries in the entire globe, excluding Greenland, Iceland, and parts of Russia. And the very northern part of the country actually lies within the Arctic Circle, which kind of drastically impacts the GDP as long as with imports and exports. It's bordered by Sweden, Finland, and Russia, and the North and Norwegian Sea, which actually helps with those imports and exports. A fun fact, kind of, is it's also bordered by the Atlantic Ocean and the coastline, followed by along that Atlantic Ocean is long and jagged, and so that can actually kind of hurt the exports and imports coming in and out of the country. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. The history and political structure. So the early settlement, first humans arrived after the Ice Age, and approximately 9,500 to 6,000 BCE is when historians dated back the first human life found in the Norwegian territory. Followed that was the Viking Age, which is from 800 to 1050, and the Norwegian Vikings explored, traded, and settled across the northern Atlantic, and that's when we first started to see that economy start to prosper from that trading. The unification. So, Norway, after the Battle of Hartford in the 9th century, Harald Fairhair was traditionally credited with uniting Norway after that conflict, and then that really resolved issues, helping the economy of the territory. After that, Christianization shaped the medieval society, and that's when we started seeing specialization, people specializing in certain jobs, and that really boosted the economy because people were able to focus on the goods they were producing in the 11th century. After that, Norway actually joined the Kalmar Union in 1397, and then they fell under Danish rule until 1814. And that didn't, after the Danish rule, they actually fell under the Swedish rule, even though they adopted their own constitution in 1814. And they didn't gain full independence from Sweden until 1905. But after that, it was great because they discovered oil in the late 1960s, and that really transformed the economy, and we'll really talk about that here in a couple slides. The political structure of Norway today, it's a constitutional monarchy with a democratic parliamentary system, kind of like we see in the United States, where the Storting, which is their parliament, holds legislative power. The only difference between us and the Norway and the U.S. is it's a monarchy, so they have a king, a queen, some one person ruling that nation. So let's talk about the GDP. Norway has seen a significant volatility of GDP in the past 10 years, so some fluctuation, but not a whole lot. A decrease was seen in 2015 due to the falling of oil prices, so people kind of fell out of jobs, and we'll talk about that with the unemployment rate here in a little bit, but that directly impacted the GDP of the country because since the oil prices fell, their gross domestic product was actually not rising and it was falling, as you can see in the graph to the right. And then after that, in 2020, the COVID pandemic obviously impacted the whole entire globe, and so that hurt every single country's GDP, including Norway's. But after that, we saw an upward trend, and there's been a peak in 2020, about 593.73 billion gross domestic product found in Norway. We saw a slight decline after that just because of inflation rates, but the inflation rate is actually going down in Norway, which we'll talk about here in a little bit, and that's actually helping the gross domestic product found in the country. So Norway consistently ranks as one of the wealthiest nations in the world because of the natural resources, which was found in 1960, as we just talked about. And so we'll kind of talk about that here on the agricultural side of GDP, because Norway actually is not a really agricultural based country, and that is partly because of an industrialization. It's not a poor country, and so agriculture does not have a huge impact, making up a 2% to 2.1% of the annual GDP in the country. But services, industry, and natural resources actually make up the majority of the GDP, like we talked. And fishing and seafood processing is also crucial in the country because they are located along the coastline and those seas, like we talked about in the location slide. So let's go ahead and talk about the currency rate of Norway. So the NOK, or the krone, is the currency of Norway, and it's witnessed rapid fluctuations over a 10-year period. As we talked about in 2015, due to that lower natural resources prices, the currency rate and the value of their actual currency went down. And then 2020, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, we also saw that. And that's a direct correlation to inflation rates. So actually, one Norwegian krone accumulates to 9 cents USD today. And to this graph to the left, you can see that drastic fluctuation in their currency rates, as it's up and down, and then plummets, and then goes back up, and then we've kind of seen it really go down over the last 3 years or so, just after that COVID-19 pandemic. So let's talk about unemployment rates. So over the past decade, the unemployment rate in Norway actually has remained relatively low and broadly stable, with the modest fluctuations reflecting economic cycles, as we would expect. And so those fluctuations in the economy were found in 2015, 2016, and 2020 and 2021, when employment rates were at their highest. And just as we've talked about before, it's because of those falling oil prices in COVID-19. COVID-19 was a pandemic. People were at home. They could not go to work because they were worried about getting this sickness. And then after the oil prices fell, businesses started to lay off employees, just as we have seen in the United States. And so people were not working, and so that infected the employment rate, because natural gases make up almost 50% of the exports and imports, which we'll talk about in a later slide. The current unemployment rate in the nation is 3.97%, as found in 2024. And we're actually seeing that going down now, because inflation rates are also going down in the country. And so over the past 10 years, it displays a pretty tight labor market in the country. As you can see in the graph to the right, there's no drastic fluctuation, maybe not even 2% or so in the country. So let's talk about the agricultural jobs in that labor market. And as we talked about, since agriculture makes up such a small part of the nation's GDP, that's just a direct correlation to the employment in agriculture. And so 2.5% of the total unemployment in 2023 was agricultural based jobs. And most of the agricultural employment comes from farming, forestry, and largely fishing, like we talked about. A gradual decrease of agricultural jobs was seen after the early 90s, and that's just because we saw that after those oil prices were after those oils and natural gases were found, people started to flock to that employment because it was bringing in a lot of money, and then agricultural jobs started to decline because we were starting to we're starting to import a lot of agricultural commodities. And the leading employment, as we've talked about, is natural gases or natural resources. So let's talk about the inflation rate. Generally, Norway's inflation rate fluctuates moderately with low consumer price increases. So kind of like, unlike the U.S., inflation doesn't really impact the consumer prices found in Norway, which is very nice for the people of that country. A sharp jump was seen in recent years after COVID-19, like much of the globe. In global and trade impacts um, inflation rates the most. So, whether they're trading and bringing in a lot of commodities from other countries really infects their inflation prices, just like we've seen in the U.S. with those tariffs being placed on certain commodities and imports. Norway's inflation rate mirrors other world leaders like the U.S. So the standard of living, the graph on the right shows a rapid increase, along with those other Scandinavian countries of Sweden and Denmark over the past 50 years or so. And so that is, because we started to see from that Norway went from kind of not necessarily a poor country, but they transformed after the 1960s to becoming a rich country in the nation, and so that led to a better standard of living due to the oil and gas revenue. Oil was found in the North Sea in the 1970s, like we talked about, and that's what helped kind of boost that standard of living. They rank at the top globally for life expectancy, education levels, and GDP per capita, and some downfalls of the standard of living are they have high cost of living, groceries, housing, and services. But since that GDP per capita is really high, that doesn't really have a huge effect on the people. And they're isolated socially and geographically. They have a language barrier because no one else speaks Norwegian, and they have long, dark, cold winters because they are in the Arctic Circle, like we talked about. Their leading trade partners are the UK, Germany, Netherlands, and Sweden, and those trading prices can be seen under those countries as pictured on the slide. So the leading imports and exports. The imports for the country are machinery, 15 billion, vehicles, 10 billion, and electrical and electronic equipment at 9.4 billion. And because of this, there's not a lot of manufacturers actually in Norway. And so when we're harvesting those mineral oils or fish and seafood, which are the largest exports, we need machinery and vehicles to help with harvesting those. So that's why we have to import them. But the largest exports are mineral fuels, fish and seafood, machinery, and computers. And the graph down below shows that like gas and oil make up 50% of the exports in the country, which is a very large portion. So as we talked about, agriculture only makes up 2% of the GDP in the country, so the imports are actually very larger than their agricultural exports. And so we see lots of imports from food preparation, wine and grapes actually, and cod, which kind of shocked me because they're a fishing country, but it's actually hard to find cod in along the Norway coast. So we don't really export a whole lot of agricultural commodities from Norway besides fish and seafood at 15.5 billion. After that, it's very small from wood and soaps and waxes. And you can kind of see that down in the graph below. So, some important agreements for the Norwegian people and the Norwegian economy is one like the UK Norway Luna House Agreement. And this was signed in 2025, so very recently actually. And this pact established a joint naval fleet with the UK. Its main job is to hunt Russian submarines, protecting underwater infrastructures like oil pipelines and cables, because We have oil pipelines because we found oil in the North Sea. And so, with those oil pipelines underwater, we need something to protect those because that is our largest commodity and economic booster in the country. And so, this should strengthen NATO's northern plan, countering Russia's growth. And UK wanted something to protect their coastline, so that's why they agreed that with Norway. Another one is the U.S.-Norway Supplemental Defense Cooperation Agreement. And Norway entered the force in 2022, updating the 1951 NATO SOFA. And SOFA created the framework for U.S. forces in Norway. So this was just enhances the military capabilities and supporting collective defenses for NATO, protecting against Russia and some other countries. So, in conclusion, like the US and many other countries, Norway has experienced significant and varying shifts in the last 10 years. These things are most likely influenced by the following: differing trade dynamics, inflation trends, living standards, and the COVID-19 pandemic actually has a very large impact. So some strengths and weaknesses about Norway's economy. Some strengths are they have abundant natural resources like we've talked about throughout the whole presentation. They have consistent economic growth with decreasing inflation rates. So with that economic growth going up and inflation rates going down, that actually makes the value of their currency technically worth more realistically. Um, they have high living standards, as we talked about, and they have a highly skilled workforce with strong institutions. Some weaknesses, though, are they have limited domestic market. They're transitioning from a petroleum-based economy to greener sectors. So we're seeing, like in the U.S., that people are wanting to go away from coal and oil, so that's a weakness that the country is kind of combating right now. And then they have a heavy reliance on oil and gas, just like we have talked about. They have nothing else really boosting their economy. So if they are going to transition to a greener sector, that's going to have a really hard time on their economy. So, a future outlook for the nation. Norway's economy outlook in the next few years appears cautiously optimistic. Their growth will likely remain modest because forecasts suggest that the mainland real GDP will grow by roughly 1.5% in 2025 and then stay near the level over the medium term. And then inflation is expected to gradually ease and return toward the roughly 2% target by around 2027, so in 2 years. And meanwhile, supportive fiscal policy, rising real wages, and improving household purchasing power should help sustain private consumption and prevent a sharp economic slowdown. And so, when we talk about that house purchasing power, we're talking about the people are actually getting to buy their own houses because they actually are kind of forced. To live in government housing half the time. And so the outlook for the country is really great and up on the um it's not on the uprise, but will hopefully stay pretty level as if oil and natural gases stay as abundant as they were. So here are my works cited pages. I would like to thank you guys all for listening to my presentation about the economy and of Norway. Have a good one.